in the spring of 1944, as the war tightened its grip around the Italian peninsula, and every town seemed suspended between fear and disbelief, a strange rumor began to spread among the civilians living near the fractured front lines. The Americans were sending airborne troops to reinforce the collapsing sector. To many Italians who had endured years of propaganda, hunger, bombings, and broken promises, the idea seemed almost amusing. They imagined nothing but reckless boys leaping from planes, untested and unprepared. A force of foreigners who could never understand the brutality of trench warfare or the cruelty of the mountains that devoured entire battalions. When the villagers gathered in the dusty streets and narrow balconies to discuss the news, laughter mixed with cynicism. They called the incoming soldiers Ragazzi del Cielo, Sky Boys, mocking the thought that anyone would willingly jump from an airplane into the jaws of German artillery. They said the Americans must be desperate, sending men who relied more on spectacle than discipline. They whispered that mountain roads needed mules, not parachutes, and that those who dropped from the sky would die before they even touched the ground. They had no idea how wrong they were. For weeks, Italian civilians watched the horizon, expecting to see a chaotic, clumsy parade of aircraft, barely held together by American optimism. But when the first distant hum reached their ears, cutting through the winds that rolled across the valleys, something in the air felt different. It began as a low vibration, so faint that the villagers thought it was thunder. Then it grew deeper, heavier, more purposeful, like the beating heart of a giant waking from sleep. Birds scattered from rooftops. Animals trembled in their stalls. Windows rattled as the sound echoed through stone alleys that had survived centuries. And finally, the sky darkened, not with storm clouds but with wings. The first C-47s appeared over the ridge in perfect formation, their bodies gliding through the air with the confidence of machines built for purpose. Behind them came dozens more, stretching across the horizon in ordered lines, each aircraft following the next with unbroken discipline. The villagers who had mocked the airborne troops fell silent. Children pressed their faces against stone ledges, staring wide-eyed. Old men removed their hats. Women crossed themselves as they watched the airborne fleet carve a path above their homes like a river of steel. Then came the moment that silenced even the most skeptical. The sky opened. The doors of the C-47s swung wide, and dozens of dark silhouettes leaped into nothingness without hesitation. Parachutes burst open like white blossoms, drifting downward with a calm grace that defied the chaos of war. One villager later described it as watching angels descend. Except these angels carried rifles, ammunition, and determination forged through months of brutal training. The 7th Airborne Division was not made of naive boys. They were hardened volunteers who had jumped in darkness, in storms, in deadly drills where a single hesitation meant death. They belonged to a brotherhood built in the sky, forged by discipline, bonded by the certainty that their mission mattered more than their lives. As they descended, the Italian villagers witnessed something they had never seen before. These men did not panic. They did not flail their limbs. They did not scream. They descended with precision, adjusting cords, steering themselves toward designated landing zones, hitting the ground with practiced movements honed in thousands of hours of training. And when their boots touched the earth, they moved as one. Within seconds, they shed their parachutes, formed squads, raised rifles, scanned the ridges, and advanced with the fluid confidence of warriors who trusted each other completely. The Italians had expected confusion. What they saw was mastery. Rumors traveled faster than the wind. Civilians ran from house to house repeating what they had witnessed. The Americans had arrived like a living storm. They were bigger than expected, stronger than expected, and disciplined beyond anything the villagers imagined. The soldiers carried themselves with an energy that electrified the air. Their boots struck the ground with purpose. Their helmets gleamed with the grit of men who had seen fire and refused to flinch. When they spoke to the villagers, their voices carried both kindness and authority. They shared chocolate with children, water with the elderly, and instructions with the local militia. And they did so all while preparing for battle with a focus that commanded respect. But respect turned to awe the moment the Germans realized what had happened. Enemy artillery thundered in the distance as word spread through German intelligence that American paratroopers had landed behind contested zones. The Germans responded with speed and fury, mobilizing units to crush the airborne incursion before it gained momentum. They had fought paratroopers before. They believed they understood their weaknesses. But the 7th Airborne Division was not like the others. These men moved with the aggression of mountain wolves unleashed into familiar terrain. They advanced over ridges with relentless speed, using the landscape as cover. They established firing lines on high ground within minutes. They cut off German patrols with surgical precision. They showed no fear. The villagers watched from windows and rooftops, holding their breath as the Americans engaged. What they saw changed their understanding of warfare forever. The airborne soldiers fought like shadows, moving silently, striking with force, disappearing into ridges, then reappearing behind enemy lines with the unpredictability of lightning. Their movements were synchronized, their orders sharp, their discipline unbreakable. When a German armored column attempted to push through the valley, the 7th Airborne engaged with explosive force. They used bazookas, grenades, and coordinated ambush tactics that shattered the German advance. The civilians listened in horror and amazement as the valley echoed with gunfire, explosions, and the fierce shouts of men fighting for survival. But it was not just their skill that stunned the Italians, it was their bravery. The airborne soldiers pushed forward even when the odds tilted against them. They fought through smoke, dust, shrapnel, and collapsing stone walls. They carried wounded comrades on their backs without breaking stride. They defended each other with a ferocity that seemed almost mythic. One Italian shepherd who witnessed the battle firsthand later told his grandson, "They moved like they belonged to another world. They did not bend. They did not break. They fought as if the sky itself had sent them." As the battle raged, more C-47s and escort fighters appeared overhead, dropping supplies, ammunition, and reinforcements despite enemy fire. The sky thundered with engines. Parachutes bloomed once more like white flowers against the smoky sky, and the villagers realized something they had never understood before. These men were not sky boys. They were sky lions. They had descended not with arrogance, but with purpose, action. And they had brought the full weight of American determination with them. By nightfall, the Germans began to fall back, stunned by the ferocity of the airborne troops. And for the first time, the Italians emerged from their homes not with skepticism, but with gratitude. They approached the Americans with bread, water, blankets, and trembling voices that struggled to express what they felt. Some cried. They had underestimated the Americans. They had mocked them. But now, as they watched the 7th Airborne Division establish command posts, secure the valley, and treat their wounded with care and dignity, the civilians understood a truth that would stay with them for generations. These men had not descended from the sky to die. They had descended to win. As dawn broke over the fractured hills of the Italian countryside, the villagers awoke not to the usual silence of fear, nor to the distant rumble of German armor, but to the unmistakable sound of American boots marching with purpose. It was a rhythm unlike anything they had heard before, steady, confident, disciplined, the sound of men who were not merely passing through but taking control. The 7th Airborne Division had carved itself into the valley overnight like a force of nature, transforming a region once paralyzed by dread into a strategic command post buzzing with activity. The civilians who had spent years hiding in basements now stood at their doorways, watching soldiers erect communication lines, reinforce barricades, clear debris, and organize supply drops with clockwork precision. The Americans worked with a unity that impressed even the most skeptical old men who had fought in earlier wars and believed they had seen everything. For the Germans, however, the arrival of the airborne soldiers was not a curiosity. It was a threat, and a severe one. They moved quickly, dispatching reconnaissance units into the hills in an attempt to identify the Americans' positions. But every patrol they sent vanished into the ridgelines. Some returned broken and shaken, mumbling about ambushes that materialized from nowhere, about shadows in the trees, about American paratroopers who struck with terrifying speed and then disappeared. German officers initially dismissed these accounts as exaggerations, fueled by panic. But when a full infantry platoon was found dead in the ravine, Precision shots placed through helmets, radios smashed, boots stripped away in a sign of total defeat. The officers realized they were dealing with an adversary far more formidable than they expected. The 7th Airborne had established an invisible perimeter, woven through cliffs, abandoned farmhouses, broken walls, and thick groves of olive trees. They transformed natural terrain into traps, vantage points, and kill zones. And as they fortified each position, they did so with an efficiency that left the Italians stunned. One villager described the Americans as costruttori del vento, builders of the wind, because their defenses appeared as if crafted from thin air, rising swiftly wherever needed. This was not a static occupation. This was preparation for war. As midday approached, the tension thickened. The clouds drifted low, casting shadows across the valley. Birds stopped singing. Dogs whined quietly inside homes. And then the first German artillery shells screamed across the sky. They detonated in eruptions of dust and flame across the outer ridges. The ground shook, windows shattered. The villagers dove for cover. But the Americans did not flinch. They moved with the calm urgency of men who had trained for this moment countless times. Squad leaders barked orders, rifles were checked, mortars were aligned. Radio operators scrambled to connect frequencies. The sound of boots increased, echoing across stone streets as paratroopers moved to their pre-planned defensive lines. When the German infantry advanced, they expected to find disorganized resistance. Instead, they walked into a storm. The first volley from the American positions hit with devastating accuracy. German soldiers dropped in the open fields, caught off guard by the sheer precision with which the airborne troops fired. Machine guns positioned in elevated barns raked through the flanks. Grenades exploded beside advancing German clusters, scattering men in panic. Snipers, hidden in the broken remains of a church tower, began to pick off officers one by one, each shot sending shockwaves through the enemy ranks. The Germans fought back with ferocity, but the Americans countered with something far more potent: coordination. The 7th Airborne Division moved like a single, unified organism. If one flank weakened, another surged forward to cover it. If a German squad broke through a wall, an American fire team emerged from the shadows to cut off their advance. The Italians, watching from their windows, could hardly believe what they saw. The paratroopers didn't merely survive, they dominated. They used every stone, every slope, every thickened patch of earth to their advantage. Their rifles cracked like thunder. Their voices carried over the battlefield with unwavering resolve. Their faces showed no fear, only determination. Then came the moment that would forever erase every trace of mockery from the villagers' hearts: the arrival of the airborne reinforcements. The sky again filled with the distant rumble of engines, and this time the sound was unmistakably American. Dozens of C-47s appeared over the valley, flying low under clouds streaked with artillery smoke. As the planes passed overhead, supply crates parachuted downward like lifelines. Ammunition, food, medical kits, mortar rounds, everything the airborne troops needed to maintain their hold on the front lines. And then, as the Germans attempted to shoot down the aircraft, the escort fighters dove from above. The Italians gasped as P-47 Thunderbolts spiraled into view, their engines screaming, wings tilted in predatory angles. They unleashed machine gun fire across German positions with a violence that forced the enemy to break formation. German units scrambled into cover, shouting orders, but it was too late. The airborne troops surged forward with renewed strength, pushing the attackers back across the ridge. Smoke filled the valley, echoes of explosions rolled through the hills, and through it all, the Americans advanced like a wave, steady, unstoppable, merciless. One Italian farmer later described the scene in his diary. It was as if the mountains themselves had come alive. The Americans were everywhere. They moved with the certainty of men who had already accepted death and therefore did not fear it. I saw one soldier run across open ground to drag his wounded friend to safety, bullets tearing the earth around him. When he reached the wall, he did not collapse, he simply reloaded. As the battle reached its peak, the Germans unleashed their final push, an armored column supported by machine gun teams and heavy infantry. Tanks rolled through the tree line, their cannons glowing from constant firing. German officers believed the sight of armor would break the Americans' will. Instead, it ignited something fierce in the airborne troops. They rallied with a roar that shook the valley. Anti-tank teams positioned themselves along choke points. Bazookas fired. Molotovs were hurled from windows and ridges. One American paratrooper leaped from behind a stone wall and planted explosives directly onto the tread of a panzer, sacrificing his position but turning the tank into a flaming ruin. The villagers looked on in awe. These were not skyboys. They were warriors, fearless, disciplined, unrelenting. Then came the American counterattack that would seal the battle and rewrite the reputation of the 7th Airborne Division forever. Moving in a coordinated line, the paratroopers charged through the valley with a howl that echoed across hillside farms. Their boots hammered the ground in unison. Their rifles flashed in rhythmic bursts. They advanced, not like soldiers, but like a force of destiny. German troops, overwhelmed by the combination of air power, ground coordination, and sheer aggression, began to fall back. Some retreated into the forest. Some abandoned their positions entirely. Some simply dropped their weapons and raised their hands, unable to continue fighting an enemy that seemed carved from iron. By late afternoon, the valley was silent, except for the distant rumble of retreating German vehicles. Smoke curled upward in ghostly ribbons. Civilians emerged slowly from their hiding places. They found American medics tending to wounded Germans as well as their own. They saw paratroopers sharing water with children. They watched soldiers, these same men who had fought with the fury of lions, kneel beside the elderly and offer words of comfort. And in that moment, the Italian civilians understood something profound. Strength and compassion could exist in the same breath. The airborne troops were not just fighters, they were liberators, and the villagers, who once mocked them from balconies and whispered skepticism in the streets, now watched with tear-filled eyes as the American flag was raised near the edge of town, a symbol that the world had not forgotten them. The 7th Airborne Division had arrived not only to defeat the enemy, but to awaken hope. And as the sun set behind the valley, casting a golden glow over the tattered parachutes still caught in the trees, the Italians realized they had witnessed something extraordinary. The moment the sky delivered their salvation. As night fell over the battered valley, a strange quietness settled across the landscape. Not the fearful silence the Italian villagers had grown accustomed to, but a deep, steady calm, the kind that follows a storm that has finally spent its fury. The smell of smoke drifted through the air, softened by the scent of wet earth and broken olive branches. Fires still burned in the distance where German armor had been destroyed. Parachutes fluttered from treetops like tattered flags of victory, and everywhere the villagers looked, they saw the unmistakable presence of the 7th Airborne Division. Men who had descended from the sky like a divine judgment, fought with the ferocity of seasoned warriors, and now moved through the darkness with the quiet discipline of professionals who understood that survival required vigilance long after the final shot. The civilians stepped cautiously into the streets, sweeping debris aside as they walked toward the makeshift American command post set up near the old stone church at the center of the village. They expected to see chaos, exhaustion, confusion, anything that resembled the fear they had known for years. But what they found instead was a scene that struck them with awe. American paratroopers moved with purpose, even in the fading light. Some were repairing radio equipment, their faces dimly lit by lanterns. Others tended to wounded comrades, wrapping bandages with steady hands and offering quiet reassurances. A group worked together to fortify the church courtyard, placing sandbags in calculated layers. Nearby, soldiers shared rations with hungry children who stared at them like heroes from a legend. And at the edge of the square, a group of Americans stood in a silent semicircle around the bodies of their fallen, honoring them with a stillness that carried more emotion than any ceremony. For the first time in the war, many Italians saw what true unity looked like. These soldiers were not held together by fear or force, but by commitment to each other, to their mission, to something greater than themselves. Their presence alone reshaped the atmosphere of the village. Even those who had mocked them now looked with admiration, humbled by the bravery they had witnessed. One elderly woman, who had lost 2 sons to the war, stood beside a wounded paratrooper and offered him a cup of warm broth. When the soldier thanked her with a tired smile, she whispered, "You brought back the sky." It was a phrase that spread through the squad that night, carried like a blessing. But the war was far from over. Long before dawn, a distant rumble broke the temporary peace. German forces had regrouped. The airborne victory had shocked them, but it had not crippled their will. They intended to reclaim the valley with overwhelming force. And this time, their assault would come at night, subtle, brutal, intended to overwhelm the Americans before reinforcements could arrive. The paratroopers sensed the shift before the civilians did. They moved like shadows through the village, checking ammunition, reinforcing defensive positions, and preparing for a fight they knew would be far worse than the first. They had faced German retaliation before. They knew the price of holding a position so deep behind enemy lines. Yet not a single man hesitated. They were the 7th Airborne Division. They had trained for the impossible. As the villagers watched anxiously from their windows, the darkness outside the town began to pulse with movement. German units advanced in silence. Infantry spread through the forest, snipers positioned on rocky ledges. Mortars carried forward to devastate American lines. Their boots crushed fallen leaves, their breaths came in ragged bursts. They knew the Americans were formidable, but they believed that the cover of night and the weight of numbers would be enough to break them. They were wrong. The first German unit stepped into the valley, unaware of the eyes tracking them from the shadows. Without a shout, without a warning shot, the Americans struck. A single flare arced into the sky, erupting into a brilliant sphere of white light that turned the night into a violent imitation of day. What the Germans saw in that moment shattered any hope of an easy victory. The entire valley was alive with paratroopers. Their silhouettes emerged from trenches, rooftops, tree lines, and stone walls. Machine guns roared from fortified positions. Mortars launched arcs of fire that rained down with devastating precision. The airborne troops moved with lethal coordination, calling out targets, shifting lines, covering each other with instinctive precision. The Germans surged forward, desperate to break through. Bullets tore through the air, shouts echoed across the valley. The Italians huddled in their homes, trembling as the battle raged outside, but the Americans held firm. They moved like an unbroken chain, an iron barrier forged from the courage of men who refused to yield. Even when German tanks emerged from the tree line, their cannons flashing in the dark, the airborne troops did not falter. They knew how to fight armor in terrain like this. They had trained for it. Anti-tank teams sprinted through the darkness, dodging fire, diving behind rubble. Bazookas ignited. Explosions ripped through the valley, lighting the faces of soldiers locked in combat. One American paratrooper leapt from behind a stone wall and hurled a satchel charge beneath the tread of a German tank, sending fire cascading upward in a roar of metal and flame. Another soldier dragged his wounded friend behind a broken cart, shielding him with his own body as bullets kicked up dust around them. The Germans pressed harder, refusing to accept defeat. They fought with desperation, pouring every ounce of strength into breaking the airborne line, and for a moment the Americans staggered. Not because they were outmatched, but because the fury of the German counterattack was unlike anything they had faced since landing. A squad was nearly overrun. Another ran out of ammunition. The valley trembled. The air thickened with smoke, screams, and the metallic stench of war. Then the sound returned. The sound that had shaken the civilians days earlier. The sky began to hum. The Germans heard it too. Their officers shouted warnings, but it was too late. Dozens of American aircraft appeared above the valley, their engines thundering through the darkness. They flew low, headlights slicing through the smoke. Parachutes burst open once more, drifting downward with supplies and reinforcements. But the true blow came from above. Waves of American fighter bombers dove into the valley, unleashing machine gun fire and rockets that tore through German positions. The sky flashed with bursts of light. Tanks exploded, infantry scattered. Chaos consumed the German assault, and through the storm of fire, the 7th Airborne advanced with renewed fury. They retook lost ground. They pushed the Germans back into the forest. They hunted down stragglers. They fought with the rage of men who understood that the villages behind them depended on their courage. The Germans, overwhelmed, outflanked and exhausted, began to retreat under the cover of thick smoke. Their once proud attack dissolved into a desperate scramble for survival. By the time dawn broke, the valley belonged to the Americans. The villagers emerged from their homes to find the airborne troops standing guard over the ridges, battered but unbroken. The bodies of German soldiers lay scattered across the fields, silent reminders of the night's brutal conflict. The Americans had held the valley against a superior force in darkness, without fear, without hesitation. They had fought like ghosts of war, appearing where needed, striking with precision, and then fading into the mist. As the sun rose over the damaged stone houses and smoke-filled fields, the villagers gathered in the square. They approached the Americans slowly, reverently, carrying bread, fruit, and whatever small gifts they could offer. One mother wept as she placed her child in the arms of a paratrooper who had carried the boy to safety during the battle. Another man, once a skeptic, bowed deeply before a soldier and whispered, "The sky did not send us boys. It sent us guardians." And in that moment, the legacy of the 7th Airborne Division became something far greater than a military victory. They became a symbol of hope carved into the memory of a people who had lived too long in fear. They proved that courage could descend from the sky, that salvation could wear boots and carry rifles, that liberation could come in the form of men who leaped from aircraft into the jaws of death and emerged victorious. The Italians had mocked them. They had doubted them. They had written them off as nothing more than reckless dreamers. But as they watched the American flag rise again over the ridge, fluttering proudly against the morning light, they understood the truth that would echo for generations. The 7th Airborne Division had not merely arrived, they had changed everything.